So this is a sneaky way for the SEC to impose their will upon companies that aren't even publicly traded. You can see how this starts to lay the groundwork for scoring actual individual people's activities. It's a way for them to circumvent the ballot box, things that they could never get passed at the ballot or public referendum. This is not the SEC's area of expertise. They are not climate scientists. They're not even chemists. This is exclusively the domain of the progressive left and really its most radical wing.
New climate rules from the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, would force all companies on the stock exchanges in America to report how much CO2 they're emitting. Not just obvious things like their vehicle emissions, but also how much CO2 was emitted when all the stuff they buy was made. Think simple things even, like tables, chairs, or pens, or say you're traveling for work, even working from home, better start calculating your CO2 emissions. The effects could be far-reaching. It's not over the line yet. A comments period has just ended, but at least one group of many are opposing the idea, and that's America's oldest consumer watchdog, Consumers Research. With us today is Executive Director Will Hild. Will, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
If it's finalized, what type of power does this give the government over the private sector?
Well, it is an incredible increase in the regulatory burden that the SEC is placing on public companies. If you add up every regulation that the SEC has ever put as far as disclosures on public companies, this is larger than the regulatory burden of all those other regulations. This is the largest thing they've ever done. So this is actually a huge increase. Even thinking in terms of one rule, like, oh, what's the big deal, is the wrong way to think about it. The regulatory burden, by the SEC's own admission, of this rule is massive. And so this is a huge increase, and it's also going to force, the SEC is forcing public companies to then force their suppliers to answer all kinds of questions around CO2 emissions. So it's also a government reaching into regulations of companies through the back door of these major publicly traded corporations. It's the SEC forcing effects onto companies that are not publicly traded, which is supposed to be outside of the purview of the SEC. So this is a huge increase in the SEC's effect on the markets, its effect on investors, and its reach into our daily lives.
So can we take just an imaginary company listed on the stock exchange? Can you go through the exact burden that they'll have to undertake?
So these disclosures are referred to in terms of what they call Scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures. Scope 1 and 2 are really the amount of emissions that it took to create the product. So there's the product itself. Imagine you make widgets. You've got your widget factory and every bit of CO2 that comes out of that factory every year to make those widgets. You've got Scope 2, which means go backwards. Okay, what were the inputs of the widgets? Are they made out of iron and bauxite and zinc and whatever? And where did you get that? And your suppliers, okay, what was their CO2 emissions? Now I want to stop there just for real quick before I get to Scope 3. That in and of itself is a gross overreach of what the SEC is supposed to be doing, because what that means is that for someone to someone to sell products to a publicly traded company, even if they're not publicly listed, that publicly traded company is going to need them to account for their CO2. So this is a sneaky way for the SEC to impose their will upon companies that aren't even publicly traded. They may just be privately owned, family owned, that kind of thing. Then you've got Scope 3, and that is asking companies to account for the CO2 for the use of their product by the consumer over the lifetime of that product. There's a number of reasons for that. One, we don't think the SEC should be in the business of trying to force companies to track their consumers, figure out what they're doing with the product. I mean, that's when you buy something, that ought to be your business what you're doing with it, and you shouldn't have this company trying to figure out or track that. Two, just from a accounting perspective, this is a nightmare and a mess. Imagine you've got two companies, one that sells cars and one that sells tires, okay? Well, both of them are going to need to track the use of the consumer driving that car, right? The gasoline emissions and everything like that, because the SEC could say to the tire company, well, they've got your tires on the car, so they're using your product. You could say to the car company, well, they're using the car to burn the gasoline. So there's massive problems with double counting here. And you may say, what's the big deal here? Well, the SEC is supposed to having these companies focus on things that are, generally using generally accepted accounting procedures called what they call GAAP accounting. Well, GAAP accounting says you can't have double counting. You can't have the same liability, the same asset double counted in multiple companies. So this is a real mess that the SEC is creating. We think it's bad for consumers and bad for these companies as well.
With this requirement, if you're traveling for work, like I mentioned, or if you're working from home, the company's got to track your CO2. What if you have kids? You got to add in extra CO2 for the employees that have kids?
Well, it's not unreasonable to think that in order to make sure that their calculations and disclosures are accurate so they don't get sued, you could have a car company that simply adds a tracker that sends data back to the car manufacturer because they want to know what your mileage is or mileage per month. So it sounds outlandish because of the dystopian outcomes, obviously. But when you look at the incentives that the SEC has now placed with some of these companies, it's not that outlandish to think that in order to keep themselves safe from securities plaintiffs' attorneys, they're going to want to start to engage in almost levels of surveillance around the way their products are used, so they can say with some level of certainty that their estimations of CO2 Scope 3 output are accurate.
So we have calculating CO2, we have reporting CO2. Do you worry that perhaps this is a stepping stone towards rules around CO2 emissions, not just reporting requirements?
Absolutely. No, a lot's been made in the media around with ESG. These companies have ESG scores. A lot's been talked about whether are they moving towards individual people having an ESG score, similar to what kind of social credit scores that we've seen reported in mainland China. And this could be laying the groundwork for that. So as I mentioned, Scope 3 requires these companies to estimate the carbon output of the use of their product by the consumer, which means they're going to have to go out into the field and talk to consumers about, let's say you bought a internal combustion engine lawnmower, okay? Well, the lawnmower company is going to need to know how many times do you mow your lawn. They're going to have to go out and ask people that and research that. And so you could see how this starts to lay the groundwork for scoring actual individual people's activities as to where that lines up with ESG. And so I do think it's a rather frightening development, especially to come out of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which shouldn't be involved in any of this, to be laying the groundwork for something like that and for having companies try and track that.
Now, you mentioned ESG. This rule, of course, would be an example of ESG. I think sometimes, I don't know if it's intentional or not, it comes across as a very vague term, hard to understand. Sure. Can you explain from the consumer's perspective what ESG is?
ESG is an acronym. It stands for Environmental Social Governance. Its proponents say this is another style of investing, and what they claim it is a view towards the long-term returns, because it takes into account certain aspects of a company's profile that will help it succeed over the long term. Take the E, for example. The E, the environmental, is really as it pertains to climate change. So you would evaluate a company like an oil company like Exxon, and you say, well, they're probably not going to do very well long term because inevitably there's going to be a whole host of regulations around oil and gas, and there's also going to be this push out of fossil fuels into renewables, and they're going to have a bunch of assets. They actually even have a word for it. It's called orphaned assets. You're going to have these oil wells and stuff like that aren't worth anything. So you wouldn't want to invest in that company under ESG because it'll hurt your returns. The problem with that is that ESG investing has been used almost exclusively as a stalking horse to inject the personal politics of the investment manager on climate change into the corporate boardroom. So these things that they say are inevitable aren't inevitable, except that ESG investors are trying to force companies to do it. So Larry Fink at BlackRock last year helped elect 3 radical environmentalist board members to the board of Exxon, whose stated goal was to get them out of the business of oil and gas discovery and recovery, of course, hurting consumers at the pump, raising prices, right? But they used ESG investing as the argument. They said, we're just doing this because it's going to actually help the returns of Exxon over the long term because they're going to be in all this other stuff that the world is moving to. But over and over and over again, any attempts by companies to say, hey, the American people don't like this, no one's voting for this. No, there's no inevitability to the idea that by 2050, the whole, there won't be any internal combustion engine cars or anything like that on the road. That's all Larry Fink trying to make it happen. And so it's sort of a circular reasoning being used to justify injecting the personal politics of Larry Fink and others into the boardroom.
So are we seeing this being used by both sides of the political spectrum to their advantage?
No, not really. This is exclusively the domain of the progressive left, and really its most radical wing. It was pioneered by them, and one way to even think about this in simpler terms is that ESG is a mechanism by which fund managers can force corporate America to simply become a political utility for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. If you look at the ESG metrics and their goals, they pretty much line up entirely with what the progressive wing of the Democratic Party would want from a policy standpoint. It's a way for them to circumvent the ballot box, things that they could never get passed at the ballot or public referendum. It's a way for them to circumvent that and to force it onto the American public.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, certainly. Like I mentioned with Exxon, for example, getting Exxon out of the business of oil and gas discovery and recovery. Yeah, that's going to hurt Exxon's profits. But as the oldest consumer protection organization in America, I concern more what it's going to do to consumers. We're already seeing the effects of that. It is raising the prices of oil and gas for everyday consumers. Just 6 months after they voted on those radical environmentalists to the board, the Wall Street Journal reported that the Exxon board, because of that, was considering divesting itself of two of their largest, newest oil and gas projects, one in Mozambique and one in Vietnam, that represented over $30 billion of American investment and know-how already invested in developing those projects. But because of these new radical board members, they were going to divest themselves of those projects. Well, there's only so many entities large enough to scoop those up on the markets, and they're not American. You have PetroChina, for example, which I should note BlackRock is also invested in. They're going to scoop those up. Well, that means that that oil and gas that would have been developed and brought here to the United States to lower our gas prices is now going to be sent overseas to whoever scoops up those assets. You're also seeing, I should make sure, I don't want to make this exclusively oil and gas. You're also seeing them go after ag. One of the big targets for the climate change folks is cows, because methane gas emitted from the back end of a cow is actually supposedly a high contributor to the greenhouse effect. So they're going after the cattle industry, trying to restrict supply of capital to that industry, and even go after their suppliers for different things. So not just the price you pay at the pump, but the price you pay at the grocery store or McDonald's or Wendy's for a burger is actually being increased by this restriction of capital expenditures, investments into ag industries.
So if we're saying that ESG is kind of being used by the progressive left, this new rule is part of ESG, does that mean that companies either listed on the stock market or maybe, like you said, other companies will start to act in a more progressive way?
Yeah, it's effectively going to force them to, because by making this part of the required SEC disclosures, the SEC is openly saying, the SEC only has a mandate to require companies to produce information that is deemed material, meaning it is something that a reasonable investor would want to use in making an investment decision, or would need to make an investment decision. By deeming this information, in our eyes, wholly inappropriately, to be material, you're basically forcing companies to admit that this is an important thing that they have to account for, that they have to take into consideration in their economic and business decisions that they're making. So absolutely, this is basically forced politicization of corporate America coming out of the SEC.
I think the SEC may argue that one of our mandates is to protect investors, protect retail investors, okay? They talk about climate risks in this new plan. My feeling from reading it is that the climate risks they're mainly talking about is from new government regulations around climate, and they want businesses to be prepared rather than being prepared for hurricanes or floods. Right. They said be prepared for the government.
Exactly. That is a fantastic point. You hit the nail right on the head. Like I said about this idea of the E and ESG just being about the inevitability of all of the things they want to happening. That's exactly, when you look at what the SEC is actually asking them to assess in terms of climate risk to their business model, it's future government regulations like this SEC disclosure. It's not, how much real estate do you own in lowlands, coastal areas, right? If the SEC actually cared about climate change, which they shouldn't because it's not part of their mandate. But if they actually did, or even assessing climate risk to a company, those would be things that you think they would care about, like changes in the local climate around a business, rising sea levels, if that's what they think is going to happen. But what they're actually asking them for is, how are you going to account for banking regulations? How are you going to come out for Department of Labor ERISA rule regulations? Like they're just assuming that there's going to be this whole new slew of regulations around climate, and how is that going to affect your business model? Not what it actually, if you supposedly look at the climate science, what is going to happen.
What part does the United Nations play in this? I believe you mentioned them in your letter.
There are a number of different groups that the SEC cites as asking for this. So the SEC obviously only has authority to require disclosures on behalf of investors. They're not a climate, it's not the Securities and Climate Commission, right? And so they cite a number of different groups that have clamored for these disclosures. The problem with that is that these different groups all have the same signatories. So groups like Climate Action 100. There's a UN committee on climate change and investing. All these organizations share hundreds of signatories between them. And so really it's a Potemkin village of support for these disclosures that the SEC tries to claim, like, all these different groups from all these different sides are clamoring for it, when in reality it's just simply the same groups in different clothing kind of petitioning the SEC.
How about with regards to American competitiveness? Because I don't think we're hearing any other countries who are going to apply something like this.
No, there are some movements afoot in Europe. ESG style is almost required in Europe, but in the vast majority of the world, and certainly the countries that we are up against in terms of capital formation, like China, for example, this is the last thing on their mind. They're doing everything they can. I think China's building like 24 coal plants a year. Their goal is to grow and industrialize and serve their citizens with more products and services, and to grow their economy. So absolutely, this as it pertains to capital formation is going, across the globe, is absolutely going to make the United States a less attractive place to invest. And that's part of the reason we are as wealthy as we are, is because of our rule of law, because of our relative low levels of regulation. People want to come here and invest and start businesses. And this is a massive hurdle that is now being put in place by the SEC to that.
Is it even possible for the SEC to audit these types of reports? Because the reason I ask is, if they're not able to, it seems that dishonest companies, which I'm sure there are some, would benefit greatly over honest companies.
Absolutely. This is not the SEC's area of expertise. They are not climate scientists. They're not even chemists. Like, it's just in terms of tracking CO2, there are a lot of assumptions that have to be made in order to arrive at these numbers. And so you're going to have a situation where it's going to be really the Wild West. You're going to have companies that are forced to make these disclosures, but if they're wrong, they could be penalized. So on one hand, as I mentioned, this is going to be a huge boon for securities fraud or securities torts plaintiffs' attorneys. But in addition to that, companies that maybe want to play fast and loose with the rules will actually benefit from this because there's no real rules around this. In some ways, fraud will actually benefit the company because, versus a company that's trying to be honest, because they can just come up with any numbers they want, really, and then advertisements say blah, blah. And so companies that are being honest will be disadvantaged because there's no clear metric here. And so absolutely, this is actually going to help companies that may be as honest as other ones.
Where exactly are we on the timeline of this rule being implemented, and what else is your organization doing?
When an agency like the SEC wants to put in a new rule, they first have to publish the proposed rule and then open it up for public comment. It's called the notice and comment period. During that period of time, groups like ours or any American citizen can put in their objections to the rule, the problems with it, both legal and practical, and then these agencies are required to respond to all the concerns brought up in every comment. So it takes quite a bit of time. But then once they close the comment period and they go through all the comments and respond to them, they publish the final rule. And at that point, the rule goes into effect, this regulation goes into effect, and will be applied to public corporations. The comment period for this rule closed earlier this month. And so we await their finalization. It's however long it takes the staff to respond to all of the objections brought up in the comment period. And then, so anywhere between 6 to 9 months, you'd expect to see this rule finalized and then go into effect. As for our organization, really all things are on the table. We obviously, as you noted, put in a comment arguing that this is not within the SEC's purview of authority and that this is bad for the very people that they're supposed to be protecting. And so we are looking at all options, whether that's consumer education to contact their representatives, but also litigation. If we feel that there is an argument to be made that the average retail investor is harmed by this, there's a very real likelihood that Consumers Research will engage in litigation to push back against the SEC's agenda here.
Looking at the letters, are people positive or negative towards this?
Well, it's a mix. I haven't gotten a chance to sort of bean count and figure out what the exact percentage is. You saw a great number of organizations, like the ones that the SEC relies on, obviously weighed in and said this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But you've seen an impressive pushback from, or I would hope, organizations like ourselves, but also a coalition of state treasurers and AGs, attorneys general, pushed back and said this is an assault on the economies of our states. One thing I should note is that ESG investing and rubrics tends to very much favor companies that are mostly just people in cubicles. So you think about tech firms and Wall Street firms and consulting firms. If you're basically working if your company is just an office building, then you do very well under ESG scoring. If you're any kind of ag or extractive technology or industry, I should say, then you don't do very well under ESG. So really, this is partly a geographic a slant. This is going to help your sort of coastal, New York, California industries that are based there. But most of the middle of the country is going to be hurt by this rubric. So your ag, like Nebraska and Wisconsin, right, and your oil and gas, like Texas, or your mining, like Arizona. These state economies are very much at risk from this type of thing. And so it would hearten to see these states, representatives say, hey, this is wrong. And I think it's also laying the groundwork for hopefully a suit from those states saying you don't have a right to do this and protect their citizens from this overreach.
Will Hill, Consumers Research. Appreciate it. Thank you, Will.
Thank you for having me.